Good afternoon. This is Lori Shapiro, the Employment Counsel at Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and thank you for joining us for this webcast today. We are very excited to have a wonderful webcast for you on working overtime. Who is eligible for pay, who will be soon, and how do we stay in compliance? Our speaker today is Valerie Barney. She's the Deputy General Counsel of Mohawk Industries. She is an expert in employment and human resources and also handles lots of other legal areas for her company. And we are very excited to have her here today. Before we start talking about the subject of our webcast, let me tell you a little bit about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. As you can see on the screen, our mission is to provide free legal assistance to nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals in the community, and we do that by connecting nonprofits to volunteer attorneys in the community who want to help them. And in order to become a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, if you're not already a client, your organization needs to be a 501c3 nonprofit, be located in or serve the greater Atlanta area, although we serve organizations almost throughout the state of Georgia, and serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals in addition to being unable to afford legal services. You can find more information out about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta on our website, and you can see the link on the slide, in addition to information about our upcoming workshops and webcasts, and we hope that you'll join us for many future events. I need to tell you that this webcast is for informational purposes only, and we can't give specific legal advice on a webcast. But if you have any questions related to your specific organization after the webcast, please contact your Pro Bono Partnership attorney or go to our website to see how you can seek legal assistance if you're not already a client. If you have questions for Valerie while the webcast is going on, please use the chat box on the bottom portion of your screen to type in your questions, and we will get to them at an appropriate time during the webcast. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Valerie. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us today. So I am going to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. There's really two halves to this presentation. The first part talks about the new regulations that are coming out that are going to be effective January 1st that relate to exemption status under the FLSA. And then after that part, we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of issues from a wage and hour FLSA standpoint that affect nonprofits. So both of those are topics that are important for nonprofits just because wage and hour issues are in the news today. Employees care deeply about how they're paid, and so both of these sections of the presentation are important, but just so that you know what's coming. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about what the Fair Labor Standards Act is and what it covers. So it regulates when employees have to be paid overtime. So it establishes a minimum wage for employees, and then it also talks about any employees that are eligible for overtime must be paid overtime for hours worked more than 40 in a week. And so it also requires employers to maintain accurate time records. That's a requirement under the federal law. And then it also talks about employees that are exempt from these requirements and employers that are exempt from these requirements. And so that just tells us a little bit about the scope of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about different topics under it. Starting with the exemption. So the Fair Labor Standards Act's been around for a while. It's been around since 1938, and during the entire period of its existence, it's had these exemptions that mean that employees who are exempted from the overtime requirements. In other words, they don't have to be paid overtime. And the primary ones there are a lot of exemptions, but the primary ones that we talk about are the executive, the administrative, the professional, and outside sales employees. And so we're going to talk primarily about executive, administrative, and professional exemptions today. So those exemptions have been around for a while, and the regulations change over time, and then how the wage and hour division of the Department of Labor applies those have changed over time, and we're going to talk about some of those changes today. But before we do that, let's cover some basic terms just to make sure that we're speaking about we all level set and understand the basics of what we're talking about. And even people who have been managers for a long time get these things confused. So let's start with that. So non-exempt is a term that means that an employee is overtime eligible. So they are sometimes called hourly. So that's someone who is paid by an hourly rate or a salary, and we'll talk about that again in a minute, but whose position is, for a number of reasons, eligible for overtime. And then the other categorization is exempt. And exempt means simply that they're exempt from the overtime regulations in the FLSA, the overtime requirements. And so it sometimes is confused with the term salaried, but a salary does not mean that someone is exempt. And this is where, when I mentioned that even people who have done this for a long period of time get confused about this. A salary is part of the requirements for an exemption, but it is by all means not the sole requirement. And so we're going to talk in detail about that to help you understand how to categorize people as non-exempt or exempt from these overtime requirements. So if you think about how this breaks down, there's three basic buckets that you have to look at when you're looking at whether someone is exempt from the overtime requirements, which means you don't have to pay them overtime. And one is salary level, and we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in just a few minutes, because that is what's changing January 1st, 2020. And then salary basis, and that is when you pay someone a salary, but it's a little more complicated than that, and we'll talk about that too. And then the duties requirement, and we're going to talk about that. And so there's all three of these things have to be met in order for someone to be exempt from overtime requirements. So let's first talk about what's changing. As of January 1st, 2020, there is a new minimum salary level. And this is one of the primary requirements for an employee to be exempt from overtime requirements. And that means going forward, as of January 1st, 2020, an employee has to be paid at least $684 a week or $35,568 annually in order to be considered exempt. So this is a foundational requirement. If they're paid $35,567, they are not exempt, and therefore they are overtime eligible. So this is a change going forward. It used to be $455 a week, $23,660 per year, and so that's a big jump. But that number hasn't been changed for a long time. Some of you may remember about 3 years ago there was talk of moving it to $47,000, and that decision was stopped. People objected, businesses objected to that. It went through the courts. The Department of Labor went back to the well and decided that instead of changing it to $47,000, they were going to change it to $35,568. So that's what will be effective January 2020. So that's just the first part of the test for exemption, but there's an additional wrinkle here that is new for these regulations, and that means that all of that money, all of that $35,000 doesn't have to be paid as a salary. Up to 10% can be paid as a non-discretionary bonus. And so that means that it can be something like a commission, it can be an incentive pay, or it can be some kind of bonus that you pay annually. And so that means that the person could make 32,000 and something. I'm not doing the math, but they could make 90% of the salary threshold, and the rest could be a bonus amount. And this is very new for the wage and hour regulations. But the rest of the pay has to be paid on a salary basis, and a salary basis means that that individual is paid that amount, and they are not subject to deductions, like deductions for hours not worked, or deductions for 1 or 2 days missed for sick pay and things like that. So that's one of the buckets of the salary test, is that they're paid a salary, and it has to be a certain amount. And then there's also a duties part of the test, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So as I mentioned before, there's 3 main exemptions that'll be relevant to a nonprofit and to most businesses. And those are executive, administrative, and professional. And there's others that are businesses may be more interested in: the computer professional, outside sales, and then there's a highly compensated employee exemption. And then there's a lot more. For example, there's motion picture exceptions. There's other kinds of exceptions that are specifically geared to different industries, but these are the ones that we generally are talking about. So let's talk specifically about the executive exemption. So in these exemptions and how they're described, there is a primary duty provision in each one. And this is where it's important to think about what is a job's primary duty. And this would apply to both the executive and the administrative and the professional. And you think about, why does this job exist? That's the primary duty. And there are some states that have more specific requirements about exemptions, but the federal law doesn't have any percentages, the amount of time somebody spends in the duties that apply for the exemption, but it really goes more toward what is the reason why you have that job. And so if you talk about the primary duty of an executive job, it has to be managing either the entire enterprise or an important part of that enterprise. And the law calls it a customarily recognized department or subdivision. And that, you think about accounting department, the leader of the accounting department. That can be an executive primary duty just because it is managing a recognized department of an organization. And so that is one requirement of the executive exemption. But the other thing, and this is a technical requirement that is very important, a position cannot be exempt under the executive exemption unless that person directs the work of 2 or more full-time equivalent employees. And so if that person does not regularly direct the work of 2 or more full-time equivalent employees, that even if they meet the primary duty test, they don't qualify for the executive exemption. So that's a technical requirement. And you may be thinking, what is a full-time equivalent employee? Just because that's not a term that we use just in regular day-to-day conversation. But what it means is you could have, for example, 2 employees, each of whom work 20 hours a week. Well, together they would be a full-time equivalent employee. And so on and so on. You could have 4 employees that work 10 hours a week. Those employees could be together. They could be 1 full-time equivalent employee. So if you think about a nonprofit that manages a store as part of their primary, their business, and so that store has a store manager. And that store manager manages 8 people who all are part-time. So long as those 8 people together, if you look at them collectively, would work the equivalent of 2 full-time employees, then that store manager could, as long as they actually manage the store, they're making decisions that we'll talk about in just a minute, that would qualify as 2 full-time employee equivalents. So the other piece of the executive exemption is that the person has to have the authority to hire or fire employees. They have to be able to have the authority to make changes to the status of those employees, or, and this is where it gets a little more gray, if they make recommendations, if they're not the final decision maker on the status of these employees, whether they're going to get written up or whether they're going to get fired or something else is going to happen to them, they're going to be hired, then if they give advice to the final decision maker and their advice is given what the law calls particular weight, then they could qualify under this duties portion of the executive exemption. So going back to my store example, let's say one of the part-time employees comes in late all the time, and so the store manager recommends to the executive director that the employee be written up. And so if the executive director relies on the recommendation of the store manager, then that person would satisfy that requirement because the executive director has given particular weight to the recommendation of that store manager. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that person can act without any oversight, but it does mean that their opinion is valued and taken into consideration and given particular weight. So for one of the important things to know about all of these exemptions, and I'm going to repeat this, so I warn you, I'm going to say this several times, this is a technical requirement. So this is not a best 2 out of 3 or close enough kind of situation. The Department of Labor really looks at these requirements to ensure that all of them are met. And so it really is not just how we say we're just checking the box. It really is a requirement that they do check the box to ensure that all of these have happened. So for my store manager example, if their primary reason for the job is to run the store, not stock the shelves, not sweep the floor, not keep things organized, but to run the store, and that's an important part of the nonprofit's business, then as long as they direct the work of 2 or more full-time equivalents and their opinion on employment issues are given particular weight, then they could qualify for the exemption. And to go back to what we said before, they also have to make the salary threshold $35,568. So all of that has to happen. So let's move from the executive exemption to another very popular exemption, and this one is a little more gray. We can all, well, some of us can do the math and figure out how many people make up 2 full-time equivalents, but their administrative exemption is a little more gray. So the primary duty of the administrative exemption, and again, this is the reason why the job exists, not any percentage of time that they spend on this, it's got to be office or non-manual work directly related to the business, the management or general business of the employer or its customers. And so to go back to an example from a company I used to work with, they had employees that were technicians that turned the knobs on a particular piece of machinery. And I had someone who had been doing this for a long time who believed that just because it was really important how they turned the knobs on this machine, that made them, made it important to the general business, therefore they should be exempt under the administrative exemption. And that is not the importance to the business is not what matters. It has to be non-manual work. So my technicians who were out there in the facility turning knobs, that was a lot closer to manual work than it was to non-manual work. But also, they didn't meet the second part of this, which is the responsibilities have to involve discretion. They have to involve independent judgment. And so let me go to a warranty adjuster in an insurance business. A warranty adjuster in an insurance business. I don't know how many of you have ever had an incident with your car, and so you deal with somebody on the phone who is talking you through your claim. That person is following a protocol, a script. And if the big decisions are going to be made, generally, if they're following a script, then that's not discretion. If they're making independent decisions that are significant, then it could qualify for the administrative exemption. And so this is where I mean that sometimes this is gray, and there's a belief that just because it has the word administrative in there, and there we have a lot of jobs out in the world called administrative assistant, that administrative assistants and people like that who handle administrative matters fall under the administrative exemption. And there are probably some organizations in which the administrative assistant has a lot of discretion and independent judgment, but that is more unusual than usual. So these are people who are deciding whether we're going to spend a decent amount of money. They're deciding whether we're going to challenge something or not. They're making decisions that have significance. And so it's not a clerical role. It's not a position that organizes things or enters things into a system or things like that. So you got to think about what kind of decision making does this person have the authority to do. So that's why I'm talking about that this is gray. We don't have math like we did with the full-time equivalent, things like that. This is more gray.
Valerie, we have a question about the executive exemption.
Okay, let's go back to that.
So let's go back to that one for a minute. The question is, can volunteer work hours count toward the 2 full-time equivalents?
Generally not. If someone is a volunteer, then they don't meet the definition of employee. Therefore, they're not a full-time equivalent. And so again, this is a very technical definition, and so volunteers generally don't qualify as full-time equivalents. Do we have any follow-up questions?
Another question related to the administrative exemption. Would a bus driver count as manual work?
I would say, so the question is, does a bus driver count as manual work? I would say a bus driver counts as manual work. Anything where you're doing physical manipulation of something, and it's a skill-based physical manipulation would be manual work. That's very similar to my 2 technicians that were turning the knobs. Very important, very high risk, very, if they don't do it well, it could be very bad. It still doesn't qualify for the administrative exemption. Do you have any more? That's all we got for now? Okay, well, let's move on. That doesn't mean that you can't come back later and ask questions on those exemptions. So your time has not passed for the executive and the administrative exemptions. So let's move on to professional. So professional has two primary types. So let's talk about the learned professional. A learned professional has a job that requires advanced learning in a field of science, I said that incorrectly. Advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning customarily acquired through prolonged course of specialized instruction. So that's, again, pretty close to the regulation. So what does that mean? It can mean something as simple as a bachelor's degree. It can mean someone whose job in science was learned. They've been on the job for a significant number of years, and so they know everything that someone coming out of a educational program would know. But what's important here is that the job requires this. One place where we get tripped up with learned professional is what the individual has versus what the job requires. So this is a job that is an accountant, can be a learned professional. Attorneys, like I am, can be learned professionals. And so you have to look here at the job and not the person. And if you think about other professional jobs, those are pretty easy. Those would fall under doctors, fall under learned professionals. But that one's pretty easy. It's when you get into other grayer areas where you need to look at what does a therapist or other professional jobs like that. And so if you have any questions about those jobs, that is a great area to reach out to Pro Bono Partnership, just because the specifics of what the job requires are really important there. And so it's really in the details there. And then let's move on to creative professionals. And I don't know how much this is implicated in the nonprofit world, but that's the other primary professional exemption. And those are people who are in the arts generally. It is a job that requires imagination, originality, those types of jobs. We're not talking about the classic example is the difference between a reporter who writes independent stories and a reporter who is reworking press releases, things like that. So copywriters for materials for training for a nonprofit. Let's say part of your mission is to train parents on parenting skills, and you're writing original materials. That could be a creative professional. So that's another one where you would want to get some advice and ensure that your position qualifies for that, because again, these are grayer than the executive exemption, and so you would want to know the details of what you're looking at and how much originality. So for example, you have artists, greatly original and a whole lot of creativity, and then you have one of the things that is specifically generally excluded is cartoonists. And I don't know about you, but I think they're pretty creative, but evidently it is not creative enough. And so that's the details that we get into, and so that's where you might want to get some help to find out whether your job actually meets the creative exemption. Okay. Teachers actually fall into the professional exemption. And so if their primary duty is teaching and they work for an educational business, a nonprofit where their job is education, then that can be an exemption. So they could be exempt from overtime requirements. So that's one that again, you have to look at what the job is. Because someone is a teacher and they are doing administrative duties, that doesn't necessarily make them a professional exemption. You have to look at what the job requires, not what the person is. Okay, so let's move into key considerations. So one of the things that I have to remind the managers that I work with on a frequent basis is that the burden is on the employer to show that a person is not overtime eligible. And one reason this is so is because from the Department of Labor's viewpoint, we're all overtime eligible. And so the exemptions are something that an employer has to demonstrate by showing that all of these criteria have been met. And if one of the criteria are not met, then the person is overtime eligible. And so that's the way you have to go into it, thinking about, okay, how do I demonstrate this? How would I show this? How would I, if someone came in here and I had to explain to them, how would I show that each one of these things were met? And this is where it's very important because labels really don't matter, and what an employee wants doesn't matter. So, for example, years ago, I worked with a facility where it was a prestige factor that an employee didn't have to fill out a time card, they didn't have to track their time. So it was high status to be exempt, and it was low status to be non-exempt, even though the non-exempt employees got paid overtime and the exempt employees did not. It was sheerly the fact of I don't want to have to track my time. And so when we came into this facility that we had just purchased, we had to explain to people that this was for their protection, and we had great resistance because of this prestige. And it's a convenience factor too. People believe that they don't have to track their time, then it's more convenient for them. But an employee cannot agree to be exempt when their job is not exempt. And so that is very, very, very important to remember, because there is a belief out there that if everyone is happy with it, then there is no problem. And the difficulty is that once people are no longer happy, then there is a problem. And so you've got to prepare for when people are no longer happy by making sure that you're doing the right thing, because sometimes people you have to discipline and then they're unhappy, or something happens, they don't get a job that they want and then they're unhappy, and you have to prepare to protect your organization and protect your mission by ensuring that these things are in place.
Valerie, we have a couple more questions. Sure. If you'd like to take them. The first one is, would pastors or ministers fall under the professional exemption, or is there some other category for them?
Pastors or ministers definitely could fall under the administrative or the professional, depending on what they're doing, because some pastors or ministers are essentially managers. They are running a program, and then some of them are professionals where they are advanced degrees or a degree, and some places even a license is required. And so yes, they could qualify for an exemption.
Right, but it's not automatic.
But it's not automatic, and nothing is automatic with any of this. So that is a key takeaway, is that the details do matter. The executive exemption is the one that is most easy to determine. The rest of them are gray, and it's going to depend on what they do. And that's a really good point to raise too, is if you want a job to be exempt, you look at it and you think, let's say you want a job to qualify for the administrative exemption. You think, what responsibilities could I give this person that would allow them to use discretion, that would allow them to make decisions? And so it's your organization that you're running. And so you get to decide, with the help of your board and with pro bono partnership and advice that you get, how you want to characterize the jobs. And if you can make a decision to have two people who were reporting to someone else to report to a manager that we call a manager but who has no direct employees, you can reorganize so that person does supervise things, then they will. Then you can ensure that somebody qualifies. So it's not just that that this is a test that you're taking. It is an opportunity also for you to look at your organization and think how you can structure it so that people have empowerment and they're able to make these decisions. Or you look at for example, a professional, you think, all right, I do need to require this kind of degree for this person. Maybe I'm looking at a job and I didn't necessarily require a therapist education and license for this position, but now I'm looking at it and it's so fabulous that yes, I can defend that this is a requirement for this job. And so that's something to look at too. Okay.
Great. One other question on this subject. Would a staff who are being cross-trained in human resources or finance in a primary department fall under one of the exemptions?
Okay, so that's a great question. So if someone is being cross-trained and they're being cross-trained in a job that would otherwise qualify as a professional or an administrative exemption, you have to look to the primary duty of the job. And if the primary duty of their job is not exempt, but they're being cross-trained in an exempt role, then it's most likely they wouldn't qualify, because that's not the duty, the primary reason for their job. They're just being cross-trained as a backup. If you get to the point where that does become the primary responsibility of their job, then they would most likely qualify for the exemption. But if it's an additional duty, then it's unlikely to be the primary duty of their job, because you'd have to think about, why do you have this job? And let's say you have an accounting person who is not a professional, who's more of a clerk, who is being cross-trained to be a human resources professional. The reason why you have them is to do accounts payable or accounts receivable. It's not for the HR role. So it's unlikely, but at some point, if that becomes the bigger part of their job and really the reason, they then become a human resources professional who's doing accounts payable as an additional part of their job, then that may be when they move over. Okay, any more questions for now?
Not for now.
Not for now? Okay. So what do you do at this point? The first thing that you would do is you would look at the new exemption, that salary threshold. And if you've got people who are not meeting the salary threshold, then you're going to have some decisions to make. But even before you do this, one of the things that you may want to look at is, because people are aware of these changes, you may want to take a look at your whole organization and ensure that people meet, based on the duties and the full-time employee requirement. Do your employees meet an exemption if you're not paying them overtime? So it's an opportunity to really audit your practices, because if you make changes as of 1/1, then it is less obvious just because these regulations are coming out. So this is an opportunity that you have to look at your organization. But if you have people who are not at the salary threshold, so they are not meeting the new requirement, then you have some decisions to make. You can reclassify them as non-exempt. That's a lot of times what happens. And so let's say that you have someone who's making $25,000 a year. Do you convert that to convert that to an hourly rate and pay them on an hourly basis? You could continue to pay them on a salary basis. That wouldn't make them, like we talked about earlier, that does not make them exempt. That just means that you're paying them a salaried amount. If someone is becoming non-exempt, one of the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act is that you keep records, and so they have got to have some way of tracking their time. So you need to think about, how will people who used to be exempt and didn't track their time track their time? And it can be, again, you can meet some resistance when it comes to this, but it's important for the organization, for you to protect your mission, that you figure out how to work through these issues. One of the concerns and one reasons why nonprofits and any small business really would like for all employees to be exempt, for all employees not to be overtime eligible, is the cost of paying people overtime. Overtime is any hours worked over 40. You have to pay people time and a half. And so if you are transitioning someone from exempt to non-exempt, then they are overtime eligible. So you'll need to come up with ways to control overtime. And that could be that you have flex time, and flex time is when you allow someone to not work at some point and you allow them to work at another point. So let's say rather than having me work, lets me take Tuesday morning off and then I would work later on Thursday. But one of the difficulties and risks of flex time is a lot of people believe that it is completely flexible. And it's not as flexible as we would like it to be, because the hours still have to be within the work week. One of the foundations of the Fair Labor Standards Act is the work week. And so if the work week is from Monday to Friday, then it's generally from Sunday to Saturday or some 2 other days in the week. And so if I am taking time off and making it up at another point, it has to be within that same work week. And so that is sometimes a confusion. I can't make it up in the next month or something, even the next week. So you can do that to control overtime. You can, yes.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But there was a question about comp time. Is that really the same thing as what you were just talking about?
Yeah, comp time is generally the same thing as what I'm talking about. And comp time is believed that it's available to people, but it is really only available to government employees. Yeah, regular employees like you and I, non-governmental employees, comp time, like flex time, it has to be within the same work week. And so you can't allow someone to, let's say someone works a 50-hour week because you have a special event. You can't tell them that they can take comp time over the holidays or something like that. And so that is a very popular belief, and this is another area that employees would really like to have, but right now, not okay. Good?
Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Other things that you can do to manage overtime, sit down and redistribute workloads, talk to employees about what's taking them the time. You can manage overtime in the sense that you can tell people that they have to get permission to work overtime, but once they work overtime, you have to pay them. That is very important. Even if it is unapproved, you have to pay it, but then you can discipline the person for working the overtime. But if you've got people who are moving from exempt to non-exempt, or just generally people that are already non-exempt, that is something that you need to watch for. And so you might think about what new or different policies that you might need. You might need a time tracking policy because you haven't had anybody who was non-exempt before. You might need processes for tracking time and calculating it for payroll, for communicating with your payroll vendor, things like that. So really sit down and think about, if people are moving from exempt to non-exempt, what do you need to do differently? So I've anticipated some of the things that I am saying on the next slide. Policies you might need to know is off-the-clock work, where you tell people that they should not be working off the clock, that you have a policy about them recording all their time, and that they need to talk to their manager about overtime that's needed. You might need to have a meal and rest break. What do you offer people a meal break? They need to be relieved from all duties, otherwise you have to pay them for the time. Rest breaks are generally paid time. If you have people who are overtime eligible, who are non-exempt, who are going to be traveling, then you might need a travel policy because those requirements are somewhat arcane. They don't necessarily make any sense, but they're very specific in the regulations about what you have to pay people who are overtime eligible. And in the world today, everyone is on their device after hours, and so you might have to have a policy that tells people if they do certain things after hours with their device, if they're checking email and things like that, that can be time worked, and so you might want to have a policy about that. Okay. So once you've looked at the decisions that you're going to make about people's exemption status, then you may need to have a communication plan to your board, to the leaders of your organization, to those employees themselves, and then think about who's going to tell them and how are they going to tell them, who's going to communicate these different things, and when, and what is the substance of the communication. People's pay is a highly emotional topic, and so you want to take a minute and think about how you're going to communicate and what you're going to communicate about the why. And so status, you need to take that into consideration. Just like my administrative staff at that organization that I talked about, who really did not want to be overtime eligible. As crazy as that sounds, it was a status issue. So think about that, anticipate those issues, and think about how to say what you're going to say. And then if you're talking about multiple people, then you might want to actually have talking points in a more formalized communication.
We have a couple of additional questions, sure. Valerie. First, should salaried non-exempt employees track their hours as well as hourly non-exempt employees?
Yes, salaried non-exempt employees should track their hours because anyone who's overtime eligible should track their hours. You have an obligation as an employer to keep good records, and that means that anyone is overtime eligible. If you think about it from the standpoint of down the road somewhere where someone is unhappy with you, how would you show what hours they worked if you didn't track those records? Because if there's any kind of challenge, if an employee can say, oh, I worked 60 hours a week, then if you say, no, you didn't, then the Department of Labor is going to believe them unless you have a document that shows that they didn't. They're always going to take the word of the employee. And so just for the organization's protection, you should have some kind of record keeping for anyone who's overtime eligible.
Okay. Great. And one other question about flex time.
Okay.
What happens if someone uses flex time in the next work week from a compliance standpoint?
From a compliance standpoint, if somebody uses flex time in a different work week, really you need to go back and pay them the overtime from the time that they worked extra. So you really need to look at the work week by itself, and if they worked over 40 hours in that work week, the week in which they earn the flex time, then they should be paid time and a half for those hours, and then just be unpaid for the other time. And this is an area that we really would like the federal government to change their regulations and allow us to do this, because from a work-life balance standpoint, this would be fabulous for employees and employers. But from a protection standpoint, the law right now is that employers cannot do this. They cannot shirk their responsibility to pay overtime by giving someone time off in another week. So that's just a flat, there are some things that there is no wiggle room, and that is currently one of them. Got anything else? We're good? Okay, so let's move to some of the other things that come up frequently in wage and hour issues. We're going to talk briefly about hours worked. How do you calculate those? How do you calculate the minimum wage? How do you calculate overtime pay? What does recording work time actually mean? And then there's, if there's any other state law issues, we'll talk about those briefly. So when you're looking at how you pay people, and we're talking about non-exempt employees now, overtime eligible employees, there's two definitions that you need to understand. And one of them is what are hours worked, which sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not. And then what is an employee's regular rate, which doesn't even sound straightforward, and it's not. So let's look at those. But these are concepts that you can understand, and if you stick with us, then that'll help you tremendously. At its very foundation, you have to think about, from the Fair Labor Standards Act, it goes down to the basics of what is work. What is the time that people should be paid for? And from the Department of Labor's perspective, it's very important that employees be paid either their regular rate or an overtime rate for all hours that they work. But nobody really tells you what work is. So let's talk about the continuous workday, because that's a key element in defining what is work. And employees must be paid from the very beginning of their workday, which is the first principal activity, to the last principal activity. And a principal activity is something that is indispensable to their actual work. And a good example of this is if an employee has to get to their computer and they have to log in to their computer to start their workday, then that very logging in is the beginning of their workday. And so that is an indispensable part of their work. So work is all the time that employee has to be on duty at your premises as the employer, or any other place that they've got to be in order to do their work. That's very simple. If they have to be there, then that is generally work. Okay. So when you have someone who is working and they're deciding that they're working, this goes back to something I said earlier about working off the clock. The law considers that if you suffered or permitted them to work, then they should be paid for that. And so that means if you either knew about it, knew they were working, or should have known they were working, perhaps by the volume of work they were getting through that you couldn't get through during regular work time, then you owe them pay for that time. And this is where a policy that explains to people about off the clock work or getting overtime approved and things like that can help you, because then you are communicating to your employees about what's expected. It still is a much better practice if somebody works and you were not aware of it, but you become aware of it, just to pay them, and then you can have the conversation then about disciplining them or whatever. But it is pretty risky to say, I didn't know they were working and therefore you didn't pay them. That's a high risk decision. Now, in certain circumstances where you might want to get some advice, that might apply, but that's pretty unusual. If somebody is working and you say, I didn't know about it, therefore I don't have to pay them, that's very unusual. And what's important here is, even if you didn't tell them to do it, some employers get hung up on the fact of, I didn't tell them they had to do it, but that doesn't make any difference, particularly when the employee, if there's a problem, is going to tell the Department of Labor, no, it was an expectation. They knew there was no way I could get the books closed for the month and work just 40 hours a week. Everybody knows it takes longer than that. So that's what that employee is going to tell the Department of Labor. And so even if you say you didn't know and you didn't allow it, that's not going to make any difference, because they're going to believe the employee. Okay? So work, again, is for the employee's benefit. All employees should be paid for all the time that they work. It's any time they're allowed to work. If you don't want them to work during over 40 hours a week, then it's your job to ensure that they don't, to prevent it. And then the employee's gonna be believed. So if you look at what the definitions of work time are, You look at meals and rest periods, waiting time, on-call time, training and meeting time, travel time, things that happen before or after work. Some words that are only used in the law, donning and doffing. I don't know anyone that speaks like that, but it generally means putting on your uniform, taking off your uniform. If you have to wear protective gear, let's say you work in a kitchen, and so you have to wear extra protective gear, then that would be donning and doffing. And let's talk about volunteer activities, because these are all areas that are where nonprofits or other small employers trip up. So meal and rest breaks, that's a question about whether it's worked or not. The law doesn't actually require you to give anybody a coffee break. There's a big belief out there by employees that they are constitutionally due to have coffee breaks, but they are not. But if you do allow breaks, then they have to meet certain requirements if you're not going to pay the person. And the break has to be, if it's less than 20 minutes or longer, then it is a paid break. So if you do allow 15-minute coffee breaks, those are paid. That's just the rule. You don't get to take those out. If you have a meal break, one thing that generally happens there is you'll have someone who's working and having their meal. If somebody is working and having their meal, it is paid. They have to be relieved completely of duties. And so if you have a receptionist, let's say, or someone else who takes calls, and if they're mostly not working except they have to stay at their desk to take calls when they come in, then they're not completely relieved of their duties, and that time has to be paid. And again, these are things that people are fine with until there's a problem, and then they're no longer fine with them. Or they don't realize that they have rights, that someone tells them that they have rights. Okay. Waiting and on-call time. Some organizations have people who have to be on call. The key here is whether the person can use the time for their own benefit. If someone, let's say, has to respond within 15 minutes, then it's unlikely that they can use that time completely for their own purposes. But if they just generally have to be available to take a call, and they can return that call within a reasonable period of time, so they could go see a movie, they could go see their mother-in-law, they can use the time generally for their own purposes, then that is unpaid time. And so when you're thinking about it, just because somebody has to be available, or they have to carry a pager, which is pretty outdated, or they have to leave their cell phone number, that doesn't mean that time has to be paid. If you are looking at on-call time, which means it is compensable, you look at how often do they get called. If they're getting called every half an hour, every hour, or 3 or 4 calls in 2 hours, then that's leaning more toward this is really work, and so they should be paid. If there's a pretty short response time, then it's most likely they could be paid. So, and then you look at other limitations. If for some reason they have to be able to drive back to the location, let's say you have a residence facility and you have someone who is on call for problems, and so they can't get farther away. They have to respond within 30 minutes, so they can't go farther than 30 minutes from the facility. Then that's looking more like they need to be paid, that's regular work. So as far as waiting time is concerned, the real key is if you are engaged to wait, meaning you are waiting to see if somebody needs you, and they may or may not need you, then that's more like unpaid. But if you're waiting for somebody to call you, and the best example I've had recently is we had bad weather, and we had employees who were told by 2 different managers. One manager told his employees that it looked like we might or might not be closed, so they could do whatever they wanted to, and they would let them know if they needed to come in. So that was one. And then the other manager told her employees that they needed to stay by the phone because she was going to give them a call and let them know whether we were open or not. And so the one who said, okay, I'll let you know if it happens, those people we didn't pay. But the manager whose employees were told that they had to stay by the phone and wait for a phone call to know whether we were open or not, those people had to be paid. And that's the real key there, is are they engaged to wait? That was my people sitting by the phone. Or are they waiting to be engaged? Those are the people who could do whatever they wanted to. Those people all went out and played in the snow, because we hardly ever get it in Georgia. Okay, let's talk about training time. Training time is paid unless, so always think about the fact that you're going to have to pay them unless, this is another, you have to meet all of these. All 4 of the things are met. It's got to be outside regular working hours, has to be voluntary, it can't be job related, and then they don't do any productive work. So that means things like continuing education could be unpaid. Let's say if a certification is required, that one could go either way. If the certification is required for the job, then it is job related. But if it's a certification that someone keeps up for their own purposes, then it's more likely unjob related. So that's one. So you would want to come back, if you were thinking about not paying somebody from training, you would want to check to make sure you met all of these factors. But generally, training time is required. Meeting time. I can't think of a meeting that I actually go to that is not required. We don't generally go to meetings just because we want to. The exception would be, there is an exception under the law of resolving grievances. Technically, those don't have to be paid. I'm not sure I would go to the Department of Labor and use that excuse. So I would say meeting time is generally paid time. Another topic that comes up a lot is travel time. And when I said that this was somewhat complicated, you are going to want to have a policy on this, because you will go back and you will consult your own policy, because you will not remember when people have to be paid and when they don't. So generally, if somebody travels from location to location during the day, then once they hit their first place that they're working, whether that's the office or the first client site, then all the time after that till the end of their workday is paid. Even if they're in the car, that's generally paid. If somebody has a one-day assignment at another location, let's say they go to a client's site, then from the time they start the trip till the end of it that's generally paid. There's a little bit of oddness when it is a multi-day trip. If somebody is traveling during their regular work time, then you pay them. If they're traveling outside their regular work time, then you don't have to pay them. And so this is again one, I know Pro Bono has policies for this. This is generally one that where you would want to get a written policy and follow it, because these rules are not necessarily intuitive, and so you're going to want to go back and look at that. So if you have an employee home to work site travel in a company vehicle, there's a lot of belief by people, if they get in a company vehicle, that as soon as they're in the vehicle that their workday starts. That is not necessarily true, but again, there are factors that you'd want to look at. This isn't necessarily a check the box, but it's pretty close to it. The use of the vehicle generally is voluntary. The employee's not paying for anything related to the vehicle. No, excuse me, let me restate that. So generally, if you're not going to pay the person, then the use of the vehicle has to be voluntary. Let's say you let them take it home with them because they want to, and then if they pay for something, then that is indicating that it is a personal use. And then if it's something that is like not a work truck. If somebody is taking a work truck home, then that generally makes it look more like it's paid. If it's generally a kind of a commuter vehicle, a regular vehicle, then that indicates more that it is not paid. And then if somebody is going a far distance away, then that makes it more like it's paid time. So again, these are factors, indications. If you have any questions, reach out for help on this one. Okay, another topic that comes up a lot in time-related issues is what is a pre-shift activity or a post-shift activity, those things that may or may not need to be paid depending. Things, if they're necessary, like we talked about earlier, logging in to the computer is necessary to the job, and so that is paid time. These really are a case-by-case kind of basis. So if you have any questions, then you're probably going to want help. Things that have been established, somebody's made a decision about these, and so they're generally not work time. If you have a time clock and somebody's waiting to clock in, then that's generally not work time. If you're walking from the parking lot to the office, that's generally not work time. And so, but employees have challenged these kinds of things, and so those are pretty clear cut. Okay, let's shift gears just a little bit away from work time and talk about minimum wage. So the current federal minimum wage is $7.25. Georgia has its own minimum wage, but it is lower than that, and so you're going to apply the federal wage. It is, they must be paid at least $7.25 for every hour worked. It comes down to that. So when you have employees who are paid on a salary, you have to look to ensure that they are paid at least $7.25 an hour for that salary. So one of the things that I talked about earlier is deductions. And so deductions are important because they can reduce someone's pay below the minimum wage, and so you don't want to do that. And so you cannot reduce people's pay below the minimum wage for things like uniforms, tools. If you require people to pay travel costs, which I don't recommend, then you can't use those to bring people below the minimum wage. So that is something, if you have a lot of deductions on people's paychecks for whatever reason, then you're going to want to take a look and do some calculations and make sure they're not paid below the minimum wage, because that will get you in trouble. And we're talking about for non-exempt employees, so our overtime eligible. So let's go on a little bit to talk about the regular rate, because the regular rate is a building block for overtime pay. So you have to pay an employee for any hours worked over 40, you have to pay them 1.5 times the regular rate. And so the regular rate is more complicated than just their hourly rate. You have to look at if their hourly pay, you have to look at if there's any incentives or commissions or things like that the person is paid. Then you have to look at things that we never think about, things like prizes and awards. If you give people Christmas bonuses, if they win a dollar value prize for doing certain activities, raising the most money, things like that, then you have to consider whether those are part of their pay and whether they have to factor into the regular rate. If you do pay people shift differentials for working a late shift or things like that, that has to be calculated in there. If you pay them on-call pay, that has to be calculated in there. And so that's part of the regular rate in which you use to calculate their overtime. There's some things that are not included in regular rate, anything that's truly a gift. And so if you have individual, let's say you're a warm-hearted executive director and you give people Christmas gifts, then if those are truly gifts and they're not rewards for service, then that can be excluded from regular rate. But again, this is all employee friendly and employee focused. So you're always going to be showing that it should not be included. Yours is going to be the burden as the employer to show it should not be included. So when people get $25 gift cards for Thanksgiving, let's say, then under the law, those should be considered as part pay and should be included, should have taxes withheld and be included as part of the regular rate, as complicated as that sounds. So other things that can be excluded, if you have insurance, benefits, retirement, things like that. Those, if you pay people for their expenses, you reimburse them for expenses. I know that seems kind of straightforward, but those aren't included as part of the regular rate. Okay? And then we talked a little bit about bonuses, prizes, and awards. So this is something, again, that is technical but important. So if the amount of the pay, the incentive or the bonus or the award is somehow based on production or performance, something the person does, then that is considered part of the regular rate. It should be included. If it is something that employees expect, they start to expect this $25 gift card every Thanksgiving, then that goes in the regular rate. If we tell them in advance that it's coming, then that is not a gift. It's included in the regular rate. And if you use some kind of formula based on people's pay to determine what their bonus or incentive is going to get, then that goes in the regular rate. Those are all indications. So the only types of things excluded are things that are truly discretionary, which means you could give it to somebody or not give it to them. It is truly discretionary, and that's pretty rare. Okay, we're going to talk very briefly about a very complicated topic, which is whether somebody is an independent contractor or an employee. And so this is something that you're generally going to want to get advice on, because we could do a whole 1 hour session just based on independent contractor or employee. So it's very fact specific. This is another one where the person doesn't get to decide whether they want to be an independent contractor. It is something that is decided by either the IRS or the Department of Labor. And generally the way these things happen is because someone is classified as an independent contractor and then something goes wrong, there's a separation, and the person files for unemployment. And then the unemployment, Georgia Department of Labor notifies the IRS, because they all talk to each other, and somehow you end up with bigger problems because the person is challenging the fact that they were an employee. And so this is an area that you would want to get some help on, because these are very fact specific, and the downsides can be very bad. But the factors that you would look at to decide if someone is an independent contractor, we talk a lot about the control test, and this goes back to structuring relationships. And so, for example, when I talked about earlier, if you really want somebody to be exempt, there may be ways to structure the job so that they meet the tests. The same thing may happen with independent contractors, but it may be that the job, there's not anything that you could do to ever structure some jobs to be independent contractors. One of which is the degree of control that you want to have over the job. So let's say there's someone who is coming and painting my house. If I want that person to be an independent contractor, then I tell them what it is that I want. I want them to paint my house, and I tell them what color, and I tell them the level of quality that I want for them to have the result of a painted house. But I don't tell them everything that needs to happen and how to paint the house. So that's an independent contractor. But if I am I'm hiring the individual painters, and I'm telling them what time they have to be there, and I'm telling them what time they have to break, and I'm telling them what order to do things and what kind of tarps to put down and things like that, that's starting to look more like an employee relationship. So it's a control thing. If you control what the results are like, that's still okay. But if you control the method or manner of how people are doing their job, then that's starting to look more like an employee. And this is, again, another very gray area, and so it's a factor test. But if someone shows up at your facility every day and they are using your computer or your equipment to do something, they've got no investment in their own equipment, they take no risk in the downsides or the upsides of what happens, then that's looking a lot more like an employee than an independent contractor. And so you would want to get some advice on that. If they are integral to the business, they are integral to your mission, then that is looking more like an employee than an independent contractor. So get some advice on that. So that concludes, we ran a little bit over an hour. That concludes my topics, but I'm going to ask if I have any questions.
There is one additional question, and that is, if someone is currently classified as exempt because of a required education or license, but they won't meet the new salary requirements, do they need to be reclassified, or will the education or license allow them to remain exempt?
Okay, so if somebody meets one of the qualifications, or one or two out of the qualifications, let's say they meet the duties test, but they don't meet the salary test. The salary test is the baseline. That is the first thing that you look at. Someone cannot be exempt if they don't meet the salary test. Under the old test, there was some murkiness about whether you could have a part-time exempt person or something like that. Under the new regulations, it is very clear if someone does not make 35,568, then they don't. It's going to take me a while before that flows off my tongue. So then they don't meet the exemption status, and they have to be non-exempt. It is a checklist that you have to meet, and that is the first one. That is a baseline, and that is what's going to be the hardest for nonprofits. So you have a hard decision to make. Do you give that person a pay increase, or do you to have them meet that threshold, or do you change and move them to non-exempt, overtime eligible, and manage their overtime? And that isn't going to be easy. It isn't an easy decision to make. But if you have to move them to non-exempt, then they've got to record their time. You have to manage their overtime. You've got to keep those records. And it is the law, essentially.
Right, and I will mention that the only exception that I'm aware of to that rule is for teachers. The teacher exemption doesn't require a minimum salary.
That's true.
But it does have some very specific qualifications.
That is exactly right. So if you have teachers and you have questions about those, then reach out to Pro Bono Partnership to get some more information about the specific requirements for teachers. But other than that, for the administrative, the executive, or the professionals other than teachers, then they have to meet that salary threshold.
And that was our last question.
All right.
Valerie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And if anybody has any questions, Pro Bono Partnership is a fabulous resource for you. Just reach out to them, and they will get you some help. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. Goodbye.